What if I told you that everything you believed about life in the Wild West was untrue? We are used to seeing endless fields, fertile lands, and abundant game in movies, but the reality of the frontier, especially in the winter months, was much harsher and more unforgiving. For most settlers, the West was not a land of opportunity, but a constant struggle against the cold, wind, and loneliness. Winter came early and often lasted longer than people accustomed to different living conditions expected. Miscalculations were too costly. Landscapes that today seem beautiful and romantic turned into deadly traps back then. Snow-covered roads and trails, making travel almost impossible. Communication with the nearest settlements was cut off for months, and help simply could not arrive in time. Even hunting, which looks easy and successful in movies, often proved useless in winter. Game fled, hid, or died from the cold, just like people. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how ordinary at first glance food products became a vital strategic reserve that saved these families from certain death when the snowy desert reigned around them. We will examine why simple and coarse food became the basis for survival. You will see how experience, mistakes, and desperate decisions helped people survive the hardest months. Most importantly, you will understand the price of life in the Wild West during those winters that are rarely depicted in films. I discovered this by accident while studying old settler diaries. It is important to understand that in the era of the Wild West, there were no refrigerators or modern preservatives, and winter lasted almost 6 months. The only salvation from starvation was a supply that could be stored in the cold or at room temperature for months. And this is where the two pillars of pioneer cuisine came into play: salt and lard. Salt was not just a seasoning, it was the most important technology of the time. Lard, or pork fat, was perhaps the most valuable product. It provided an incredible amount of calories necessary to sustain life and hard labor in cold conditions. 1 ounce of lard could contain over 250 kilocalories, which was critically important for a man who had to chop wood or clear snow. It could be stored in barrels covered with salt for an almost unlimited time without requiring any special care. Salt not only prevented the growth of bacteria, but also drew all excess moisture out of the meat and lard, creating an unfavorable environment for spoilage. Salted pieces of pork or beef, called salted meat, were stacked in tight rows in wooden barrels. They were then covered with strong brine, which made the product virtually eternal. Pigs were the ideal livestock for the pioneers because their meat, especially the fat, had the perfect texture and chemical composition for long-term storage. Unlike beef, pork fat has a lower melting point, but it is much more amenable to salting without becoming tough and stringy. In winter, every family slaughtered pigs, and this process, called slaughter, became a key event of the year. Modern people often perceive salt simply as a spice, not realizing that in those days it was a real luxury and a strategic commodity. It was very expensive, and its delivery to the frontier was fraught with enormous difficulties and dangers. Not only delicious food depended on the amount of salt, but also the very survival of the family. Lard was also rendered from fat, pure fat that was stored in clay pots. Lard was used not only for frying and adding to porridge, but also for making ointments, lubricating tools, and even as fuel for lamps. It was a multifunctional resource that was valued as much as gold. It is important to note that the constant consumption of such food, rich in salt and fat, was not very healthy in the long term, but in the harsh winter conditions, it was a necessary sacrifice. The choice was not between healthy and unhealthy food, but between life and death. It was these supplies that provided the energy to fight frostbite and disease. Many pioneers made the mistake of trying to preserve meat by simply hanging it out in the cold. However, even severe cold does not guarantee preservation. Meat can become windblown, eaten by rodents, or spoiled during thaws. Only the right combination of salting and smoking provided a reliable guarantee. Thus, lard and salt were not just products, but the basis of all pioneer logistics. They allowed families to endure periods when hunting was difficult and crops lay under the snow. They were the invisible armor that protected against the main enemy, hunger. We are very interested in hearing your opinion. What do you think about how such a simple product as salt could influence the course of the continent's history? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Want to know the main secret of the pioneers' supplies? In addition to meat and lard, grains were a vital supply, especially flour. However, flour, as we know it, did not keep for long, especially in conditions of high humidity and the presence of pests. Therefore, the pioneers came up with several ways to keep their bread supplies from spoiling until spring. For people on the frontier, flour meant not just food, but the ability to survive the winter. Without it, it was impossible to prepare hearty meals that gave strength for hard work. The loss of flour supplies often meant starvation in the middle of winter. That is why they were extremely careful about its storage. First, the grain was stored in as unprocessed a form as possible. Whole wheat, rye, or corn grains were much more resistant to spoilage than flour. They were poured into airtight bags or wooden chests and kept in dry cellars where the temperature was stable. Such cellars were often dug out by hand and reinforced with boards or stone. The main thing was to protect the grain from dampness and sudden temperature changes. Even a small amount of moisture could lead to mold growth. Therefore, the storage area was checked regularly, especially after heavy snowfalls and thaws. Grain was usually ground as needed. For this purpose, either a small hand mill was used, or people went to the nearest water mill if there was one within reach. This approach allowed them to always have fresh flour, avoiding rancidity. Hand mills were heavy and required considerable effort. Women and children were often responsible for grinding, spending long hours on this task, but fresh flour was worth the effort. It was better suited for baking and produced more nutritious bread. Corn was the key grain on the frontier. It was unpretentious, yielded excellent harvests even on poor soils, and, most importantly, could be stored for a very long time. It was used to make corn flour, which was the basis for tortillas, porridge, and the famous cornbread. Corn became a real lifesaver for many families. Even if the wheat crop failed, corn often survived. Its grains suffered less from pests and withstood the long winter more easily. Therefore, corn crops were considered mandatory. Cornbread, unlike wheat bread, was made without yeast and could be very dense, which also contributed to its longer shelf life. It did not rise, but it was filling and high in calories. Such bread could be taken on the road or stored for weeks. It was often baked in large batches in advance. After cooling, the bread was wrapped in cloth and stored in a dry place. Even when it became hard, it could still be eaten by soaking it in water or milk. If flour was stored, it had to be coarsely ground. High-grade wheat flour spoiled faster because it did not contain bran, which protected it from moisture. Coarse flour retained its nutritional value and resistance to spoilage throughout the winter. In addition, such flour kept people feeling full for longer. This was extremely important in conditions of hard labor. People noticed that coarse bread kept their strength longer. Therefore, fine grinding was considered more of a luxury than a necessity. Another important bread supply was crackers and biscuits. Bread was specially dried to a rock-hard state to remove all moisture. This product, known as hard bread or dry rations, could be stored for years without losing its properties. But knowledge of the area was only half the battle. Ready to find out how simple root vegetables were turned into a treasure that could be stored until spring? You've definitely never heard of this unique secret. In the summer, the pioneers planted not only grain, but also large quantities of root vegetables. These unpretentious and calorie-rich products were ideal for winter storage. They did not require preservation with salt or drying, but needed a special approach to storage that turned the ground into a natural refrigerator. The most popular root vegetables were potatoes, turnips, carrots, and beets. Turnips in particular were incredibly hardy and could grow on the poorest soils. They yielded a large harvest and stored well. The secret lay in vegetable pits or cellars. Pioneers dug deep pits in the ground, away from their homes, to maintain a stable temperature and humidity. The pit had to be deep enough so that its bottom would not freeze even in the most severe frosts. The root vegetables were placed in the pit and covered with layers of straw or sand. The straw served as insulation, and the sand as an adsorbent, absorbing excess moisture and preventing rot. The pit was covered with boards and then a thick layer of earth to completely prevent freezing. This pit created the perfect microclimate. The temperature inside remained just above freezing, and the humidity was high enough to prevent the vegetables from drying out. As a result, the root vegetables remained fresh and crisp until spring, retaining most of their vitamins and nutrients. It was a real underground treasure. Potatoes and turnips were used to prepare the main winter dishes: stews, soups, and mashed potatoes. They provided the necessary carbohydrates and fiber, which were especially important in the context of heavy fatty foods. Equally important was the fact that root vegetables were a source of vitamin C, which helped fight scurvy, a disease that often afflicted settlers. The ability to add fresh carrots or potatoes to meat was a real luxury that supported physical and mental health. This resourcefulness allowed them to survive the long winter months with minimal losses. It was a secret known to few. Don't forget to like this story about the underground treasures of the Wild West if you enjoyed it. What you are about to learn will change your perception of the pioneers' winter diet. Winter on the frontier was a time of acute vitamin deficiency. Fresh fruits and berries were, of course, unavailable. But the pioneers knew how to preserve the summer harvest for many months. They used an ancient and incredibly effective method of drying to preserve the nutritional value and taste of berries and fruits. Drying was the ideal method of preservation. It removed almost all moisture, making the product unattractive to bacteria and mold. Dried fruits and berries had a high concentration of sugar and calories, making them an excellent source of quick energy. Everything that grew was dried: apples, pears, wild plums, and of course, berries. Wild berries, blueberries, blackberries, cranberries were rich in vitamins and harvested in huge quantities. They were spread in a thin layer on flat roofs, under awnings, or in specially made dryers where they dried in the sun and wind. After drying, the berries and fruits became very compact, which was extremely important for storage. They were poured into linen bags or tightly packed into wooden boxes. In this form, they could be stored in a dry place for many months without losing their properties. Dried apples and berries were used to make compotes, which were drunk hot to warm up. They were also added to porridge and baked goods. A small handful of dried berries could significantly improve the taste of bland corn porridge. It is a mistake to think that dried foods were only for dessert. They were a strategically important addition to the diet. Dried peaches or apricots, if they could be obtained, were especially valuable because they provided variety in taste and valuable minerals. Dried pumpkin held a special place. Pumpkins were very productive, easy to grow, and stored well when fresh. But when dried, they became a light and convenient staple. They were cut into thin rings, dried, then ground up and added to bread or soups. Pumpkin was an excellent source of fiber and beta-carotene. It was a great way to preserve summer vitamins. It's amazing how pioneers used simple drying for such effective preservation. In the next chapter, you'll learn what was most valuable among the pioneers' supplies. The most caloric and protein-rich food in the pioneers' winter diet was undoubtedly dried meat. Unlike salted meat, which was stored in brine, this product was dehydrated as much as possible, making it light, portable, and almost eternal. This method of storing meat, often called jerky, from the Spanish charqui, was borrowed from Native American tribes. Game meat, deer, elk, antelope, and sometimes beef, was used for drying. The meat was cut into very thin strips, no more than half a centimeter thick. The main goal was to maximize the surface area for rapid evaporation of moisture. The strips of meat were first lightly salted and sometimes marinated in spices, if available. They were then hung out in the sun and wind or over a slowly smoldering fire, which produced a small amount of smoke for additional preservation. The whole process could take several days depending on the weather. Perfectly dried meat became tough and brittle, but retained all its nutritional properties. It was a highly concentrated source of protein. 10 pounds of raw meat yielded only 1 pound of jerky, but the nutritional value remained almost the same. Jerky was the perfect food for hunters, trappers, and those who went on long winter expeditions. It didn't take up much space, didn't spoil in a bag, and didn't require cooking. You could just chew it to get the energy you needed. It is important to note that, as with salted meat, dried meat was very salty and required drinking large amounts of water, but that was a small price to pay for the chance to survive the winter. These supplies were the basis of winter food security. Are you ready for the shocking truth? The most fragile, yet incredibly valuable winter food was eggs. Chickens stopped laying when the cold weather set in, so preserving the summer and fall egg harvest until spring was a task of paramount importance. Pioneers used a unique and effective method for this, which is now almost forgotten. The usual method of storing eggs, for example, in straw, did not guarantee their preservation for more than a few weeks. The shell was porous, and bacteria quickly penetrated inside. To solve this problem, the pioneers used liquid glass or sodium silicate. The eggs were carefully placed in large clay pots or wooden buckets. They were then poured over with a solution of liquid glass diluted with water. The liquid glass penetrated the pores of the shell, sealing them and creating an airtight barrier. Sodium silicate did not affect the taste or nutritional properties of the egg's contents, but it completely prevented air and bacteria from entering. When stored properly in a cool cellar, eggs in liquid glass could remain fresh for up to 6 to 9 months. It was true alchemy of preservation. Eggs were an incredibly valuable source of protein and fat, especially necessary during the cold season. They were used for baking, omelets, and simply boiled or fried. Having fresh eggs in winter was a true indicator of a family's prosperity and foresight. Another storage method used by pioneers was to grease the shells with fat. The eggs were thoroughly rubbed with melted animal fat, which also clogged the pores. This method was simpler, but resulted in a shorter shelf life of about 3 months. It should not be forgotten that eggs were also necessary for baking, which was especially important on holidays. The opportunity to bake a pie or cake in the middle of winter was a small celebration of life. They were a nutritious but fragile part of the diet. In the next chapter, we will talk about their unique system of logistics and survival. During the era of the Wild West, sugar was an expensive and hard-to-find commodity that not everyone could afford. Therefore, pioneers sought and found effective local substitutes that not only added sweetness, but also stored well and provided the necessary calories. The main substitutes were honey and molasses. Honey was an ideal product for storage. Thanks to its high sugar content and low moisture content, it did not spoil and did not require any additional preservatives. It is believed that honey found in Egyptian tombs was still edible. It was a true gift of nature. Honey was not only used as a sweetener for tea, porridge, and baked goods, it was also very caloric and had healing properties. It was given to the sick to maintain their strength and was also used to heal wounds. Families who kept bees had a huge advantage. The second most important substitute was molasses. Molasses was a byproduct of sugar production, most often from sugar cane. But in the north it was made from sugar beets or sorghum juice. It was cheaper than honey and had a distinctive caramel flavor. Overall, having supplies such as honey and molasses was not only a matter of taste, but also of survival. They provided quick carbohydrates and calories needed to maintain energy in harsh winter conditions. In addition, they were an important source of moral support, allowing people to prepare something resembling a festive treat. Unlike liquid milk, which soured quickly, cheese was an ideal way to preserve dairy products. Pioneers who kept cows tried to process as much milk as possible into hard cheeses that could be stored throughout the winter and even longer. Cheese was an excellent source of protein, fat, and calcium. Cheese was made in late summer and early fall when cows produced the most milk. The manufacturing process required a lot of patience and strict adherence to technology. First, the milk was curdled using rennet. Then the cheese mass was pressed to remove excess whey. The resulting cheese heads, most often cheddar or similar, were hard and dense. The main secret to long-term storage was salting and coating with wax or fat. The cheese was thoroughly rubbed with salt and then coated with melted beeswax or lard. Wax or fat created an airtight shell that protected the cheese from mold, drying out, and insects. In this form, the cheese heads were stored on wooden shelves in a cool, dry cellar. The cheese could mature for several months, becoming only better and more aromatic. Making and storing cheese required a certain amount of skill. Mistakes in salting or pressing could ruin the entire batch of cheese, which would be a real disaster. Therefore, cheese making was a highly respected skill.
The meal is sparse, but it will have to do. Another day of survival in the harsh wilderness.
Along with meat and dairy products, pioneers actively stocked up on legumes, beans, peas, and lentils. These products were incredibly valuable because they were an excellent source of plant protein, which perfectly complemented animal foods. Legumes were cheap, easy to grow, and most importantly, had an almost unlimited shelf life. Beans and peas were grown in large quantities because, like corn, they were undemanding in terms of soil. After harvesting, they were dried, cleaned, and poured into airtight bags or large clay jugs. They were stored in dry, cool places protected from rodents. During the winter months, legumes were the basis of many dishes. They were used to make hearty soups that helped keep people warm. The famous bean soup, or bean steak, was a staple on cold days. Beans cooked with a piece of salted meat or bacon made for a very filling and nutritious meal. Many modern people avoid legumes because of the lengthy cooking process, but this was not a problem for the pioneers. They soaked them overnight and then cooked them for several hours. Time was the only resource they had in abundance. For pioneers who lived near rivers, lakes, or coastal areas, fish was an important addition to their meat diet. Like meat, fish was rich in protein, but unlike meat, it was often easier to obtain in winter through ice fishing. However, fish had to be properly prepared for long-term storage. The most common methods of preserving fish were drying and smoking. Fish was gutted, salted, and then hung out to dry in the open air or in special smokehouses. Salt, as always, was the key preservative. Dried fish, like jerky, was light and very high in calories. It could be stored in bags and taken on the road. Before consumption, it was either soaked or simply chewed. It was less popular than meat, but was valued for its unique taste and omega-3 rich fats. Fish, especially fatty fish, was an excellent source of fat. Fat was rendered from fish heads and entrails, which was then used in food, just like lard. This fat was important for balancing fats in the winter diet. Smoking fish not only gave it a long shelf life, but also a special aroma. Smoked fish could be a real delicacy on the winter table. It was stored hanging in dry, cool pantries, protected from insects. Pioneers also used fish to make fish pemmican. Minced dried fish fillets were mixed with fat. This product was especially popular among indigenous peoples and trappers who lived far from settlements. Overall, these 10 foods, lard and salt, grains, root vegetables, dried fruit, dried meat, eggs, honey, cheese, legumes, and fish, formed the basis of a pioneer family's food security. They were the result of centuries of experience adapted to the harsh conditions of the frontier. It was not just a diet, but a carefully thought-out survival strategy. We have seen that the survival of pioneer families in the harsh winters of the Wild West was far from a romantic story of endless expanses. It was daily hard work to prepare and store food, where every gram of salt, fat, or flour mattered. Their diet was simple but incredibly effective. It focused on calorie content and shelf life, which allowed them to survive the long months until the new harvest. These 10 foods are a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. They prove that great victories begin with small, smart decisions. The ability to appreciate and preserve food was a key skill that was passed down from generation to generation. We can learn a lot from these people who turned everyday foods into their salvation. Which of these 10 foods do you think is the most ingenious in terms of storage and survival? Was it the indestructible pemmican or eggs in liquid glass? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes about life in the Wild West.